The rain pelted against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sterling Innovations' executive suite, each drop racing down the glass like tears on a cold face. Nathan Sterling stood motionless behind his mahogany desk, his steel-gray eyes reflecting the storm outside. At 32, he had built an empire that most men could only dream of. Yet tonight, he felt more trapped than triumphant. The leather chair creaked as he sank into it, loosening his Italian silk tie. The weight of expectation pressed down on his broad shoulders like an invisible burden. His mother's words from that morning echoed in his mind, sharp and unforgiving. "The board is losing confidence, Nathan. Your playboy reputation is damaging our family's legacy. You need stability, respectability. You need a wife." Victoria Sterling had never been one to mince words. The matriarch of the Sterling dynasty commanded respect through fear, her perfectly manicured fingers always pulling the strings from behind the scenes. When she spoke, even powerful men listened. But Nathan had spent years resisting her demands, building his company through innovation rather than image. Until now, the merger with Blackstone Industries hung in the balance. Billions of dollars waited on the decision of conservative investors who questioned whether a billionaire could provide the steady leadership they sought. His younger brother Oliver circled like a vulture, ready to swoop in if Nathan stumbled. The family's board of directors had made their position clear. Marriage meant security, and security meant approval. Nathan's jaw clenched as he remembered the manila envelope his mother had placed on his desk that morning. Inside lay a photograph and a brief biography of Grace Hamilton. 25 years old, daughter of his mother's college roommate. The connection seemed convenient, almost too perfect. Yet as he studied the image, something had stirred within him, something he couldn't quite name. Grace Hamilton was not what he expected. Where society's elite daughters adorned themselves with designer labels and artificial perfection, she appeared natural, almost luminous in her simplicity. Her chestnut hair fell in gentle waves past her shoulders, framing a face that spoke of kindness rather than calculation. Her green eyes held depth, as if they had seen struggles that money couldn't solve. The biography revealed life far removed from his world of privilege. Grace worked part-time at the downtown public library while pursuing her art degree. Her father, James Hamilton, battled a rare heart condition that insurance barely covered. Medical bills had consumed their modest savings, leaving them teetering on the edge of financial ruin. The Hamilton family's desperation made them ideal candidates for his mother's manipulative scheme. Across the city, in a small apartment above a bakery, Grace Hamilton sat beside her father's hospital bed. Holding his weathered hand in both of hers, the steady beep of medical monitors provided a rhythmic backdrop to her whispered prayers. James Hamilton had always been her hero. A kind man who taught literature at the local community college until his illness forced early retirement. "Gracie," he whispered, his voice weak but filled with love. "You shouldn't sacrifice your dreams for an old man like me." Grace squeezed his hand gently, tears threatening to spill from her emerald eyes. "You're not old, Dad. You're going to get better. The new treatment will work. I know it will." But the truth weighed heavily on her heart. The experimental treatment cost more than their annual income combined. Their insurance company had denied coverage, deeming it too risky and expensive. Without it, doctors gave her father 6 months to live. With it, he might have years ahead of him. Years to walk her down the aisle when she truly fell in love. Years to meet his grandchildren. The knock on their apartment door came at precisely 8 o'clock. Grace opened it to find Mrs. Victoria Sterling standing in the hallway, dressed in an elegant black coat that probably cost more than Grace's yearly rent. The older woman's silver hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, her blue eyes sharp and calculating. "Miss Hamilton," Victoria said, her voice smooth as silk yet cold as winter. "We need to talk." Grace invited her in, serving tea in chipped porcelain cups while Victoria explained the arrangement with clinical precision. Marriage to Nathan Sterling in exchange for complete coverage of her father's medical expenses. Plus, a substantial sum that would ensure James Hamilton's comfort for the rest of his life. The contract would last 1 year, after which they could divorce quietly, allowing both parties to pursue their separate lives. Your father's treatment begins immediately upon signing, Victoria added, producing legal documents from her designer handbag. Nathan is a busy man with little time for sentiment. He needs a wife who understands that this is purely a business arrangement. Grace's hands trembled as she read through the contract terms. Marriage without love, intimacy without affection, a year of her life in exchange for her father's survival. The choice seemed impossible until she looked toward the bedroom where her father lay sleeping. His breathing labored and shallow. I need to think about it, Grace whispered. Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. You have until tomorrow evening. The wedding would take place within the week. After Victoria left, Grace sat in the darkness of her small living room, watching the city lights twinkle like distant stars. She thought of her dreams of becoming an artist, of finding love with someone who would cherish her heart. Those dreams seemed fragile now, like soap bubbles floating away on the wind. The next evening, Grace found herself standing outside Chez Laurent, the most exclusive restaurant in the city. Her simple blue dress felt inadequate among the luxury cars and designer gowns surrounding her. When she spotted Nathan Sterling stepping out of a black Bentley, her breath caught in her throat. He was even more striking in person than in photographs. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the confident grace of a man accustomed to power. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit tailored to perfection. But it was his eyes that made her pause, steel gray and guarded, as if he had built walls around his soul. Nathan's gaze swept over her as she approached, his expression unreadable. Miss Hamilton, I presume. His voice was deep and smooth, but there was no warmth in it. Grace nodded, offering a tentative smile. Mr. Sterling, thank you for meeting me. The dinner that followed was a careful dance of polite conversation and unspoken boundaries. Nathan spoke of business mergers and market fluctuations, while Grace shared stories of her work at the library and her father's condition. She noticed how his jaw tightened whenever she mentioned her father's illness, though whether from impatience or something else, she couldn't tell. You understand the terms, Nathan said finally, cutting his steak with precise movements. This is not a romantic arrangement. We maintain separate lives, separate bedrooms. Public appearances only when necessary for business purposes. Grace met his gaze steadily, surprised by her own composure. I understand perfectly, Mr. Sterling. This is about saving my father's life. Nothing more. Something flickered in Nathan's eyes, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. They signed the preliminary agreement over dessert, their signatures sealing both their fates. The wedding took place the following Saturday at City Hall. A sterile ceremony witnessed only by Victoria Sterling and Grace's father, who insisted on attending despite his weakened condition. Grace wore a simple ivory dress she'd found at a vintage shop, while Nathan appeared in another perfectly tailored suit, his expression as cold as marble. The justice of the peace spoke the traditional words, while Grace tried to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest. When Nathan slipped the platinum band onto her finger, his touch was brief and impersonal. Their kiss was nothing more than a brush of lips, lasting barely a second, as they signed the marriage certificate. Grace caught sight of her father's proud smile. James Hamilton believed his daughter had found love with a wonderful man who would take care of her. She couldn't bear to tell him the truth. The Sterling mansion loomed before them like a monument to wealth and power. Nathan's driver held the car door open as Grace stepped onto the circular driveway, her small suitcase looking pitiful beside Nathan's imposing home. The house was beautiful in a cold, museum-like way. All marble columns and pristine gardens. Double quotes, Mrs. Patterson will show you to your room, Nathan said curtly as they entered the grand foyer. An elderly woman with kind eyes appeared, offering to carry Grace's bag. The master bedroom? Mrs. Patterson asked. Nathan's voice cut through the air like ice. No, the blue guest room on the second floor. Mrs. Sterling will be staying there. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks as the housekeeper's eyes widened slightly. Nathan was already walking away, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. I have work to do. I'll be in my study until late. Please don't disturb me. The blue guest room was larger than Grace's entire apartment, curated in shades of navy and cream with a view of the rose garden. Yet despite its elegance, it felt more like a prison cell than a bedroom. Mrs. Patterson helped her unpack. chatting kindly about the house routines and mealtimes. "Mr. Nathan isn't usually so cold," the housekeeper whispered as she folded Grace's simple clothes into the ornate dresser. "He's been under tremendous pressure lately. Perhaps you'll be good for him." Grace managed a weak smile, wondering if Mrs. Patterson could see through their charade. That night, as Grace lay in the enormous bed surrounded by luxury she'd never known, she heard Nathan's footsteps in the hallway. They paused outside her door for a long moment before continuing to his room at the far end of the corridor. She pulled the silk comforter up to her chin, trying to understand the strange ache in her chest. She had married a stranger to save her father's life. She had expected coldness, distance, a purely business arrangement. But something in Nathan's eyes during their brief conversations suggested depths he kept carefully hidden. Despite his harsh words and icy demeanor, Grace sensed pain beneath his polished exterior, a vulnerability he refused to acknowledge. As rain began to fall against her bedroom windows, Grace closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for her father's health and strength to survive the year ahead. She had no idea that in the master bedroom down the hall, Nathan Sterling lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her image burned into his memory like a brand he couldn't erase. The marriage had begun as a contract, cold and calculated. But something was stirring in the shadows of their arrangement, something neither of them expected or wanted to acknowledge. Love had a way of blooming in the most unlikely places, and the Sterling mansion was about to become the stage for a transformation that would change both their lives forever. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the walls of their gilded prison, two wounded souls had taken the first tentative steps toward healing each other's broken hearts. The morning sun filtered through the crystal chandeliers of the Sterling mansion dining room, casting rainbow patterns across the polished mahogany table. Grace sat alone at the far end, her small frame dwarfed by the enormous space. The silence felt heavy, broken only by the gentle clink of her spoon against the fine china teacup. Mrs. Patterson appeared with fresh coffee, her weathered face creased with concern. "Mr. Nathan left early for the office again," she said softly. "Third time this week, he skipped breakfast." Grace nodded, taking a small sip of her coffee. In the 2 weeks since their wedding, she had barely seen her husband outside of brief, awkward encounters in the hallway. Nathan left before dawn and returned well past midnight, treating their shared home like an expensive hotel rather than a place of warmth and connection. "He works too hard," Mrs. Patterson continued, refilling Grace's cup. "Ever since his father passed 5 years ago, that boy has carried the weight of the world on his shoulders." The housekeepers. Words stirred something in Grace's chest. She realized how little she knew about Nathan beyond his reputation as a ruthless businessman. The walls of his study were lined with awards and newspaper clippings, but nowhere did she see family photographs or personal mementos that might reveal the man beneath the corporate facade. After breakfast, Grace wandered through the mansion's sprawling gardens. The roses were in full bloom, their petals soft as silk beneath her fingertips. She found herself sketching the intricate patterns of light and shadow, her artistic eye capturing details that others might overlook. Art had always been her refuge, her way of making sense of a world that often felt overwhelming. "Those are beautiful," came a voice behind her. Grace turned to find Maria, one of the younger housekeepers, peeking over her shoulder at the sketch pad. The girl's dark eyes sparkled with genuine admiration. "Thank you," Grace said, closing the pad self-consciously. "It's just a hobby." "My grandmother was an artist," Maria said, settling onto the garden bench beside Grace. "She painted murals in our village church back in Mexico. She always said art reveals the soul of the artist." Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest. Since arriving at the mansion, Maria was the first person to speak to her as an equal rather than as Mrs. Sterling, the mysterious wife who appeared from nowhere. "Would you like to see more?" Grace asked tentatively. Maria nodded eagerly, and Grace opened her sketchbook to reveal pages of drawings. Flowers from the garden, architectural details of the mansion, candid portraits of the household staff going about their daily routines. Each sketch captured not just the physical appearance, but the essence of her subjects, her quiet dignity and unspoken stories. "These are incredible," Maria breathed. You've made us all look so beautiful, so important. Grace blushed at the compliment. You are important. Every person in this house has value. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of car doors slamming in the front courtyard. Grace glanced toward the mansion to see Nathan emerging from his black Bentley. His usually perfect hair slightly disheveled, his tie loosened. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders. Rough day at the office, Mrs. Patterson said, peering beside them with a knowing look. The Blackstone merger negotiations aren't going well. His mother's been calling all afternoon. You know how that affects him. Grace watched as Nathan disappeared into the house, his footsteps echoing through the marble foyer. Something pulled at her heart, an unexpected urge to comfort him despite their cold arrangement. That evening, Grace found herself standing outside Nathan's study, holding a cup of herbal tea that Mrs. Patterson had prepared. She could hear him on the phone, his voice sharp with frustration. The board is breathing down my neck, Oliver. If this merger falls through, they'll have the ammunition they need to question my leadership. There was a pause, then a bitter laugh. Yes, I know marriage was supposed to solve this problem. Unfortunately, having a wife and appearing stable are apparently two different things. Grace's cheeks burned at his words. She set the tea tray on a nearby table and turned to leave. But Nathan's voice stopped her. No, she's not the problem. Grace is actually quite remarkable. Not that it matters for our arrangement. The words hung in the air as Grace pressed her back against the wall, heart racing. Before she could decide whether to flee or announce her presence, the study door opened and Nathan appeared, nearly colliding with her. Grace, he said, startling. His steel-gray eyes took in the tea tray, then met her gaze. I didn't know you were there. Mrs. Patterson thought you might want some tea, Grace said softly, gesturing toward the tray. You seemed stressed when you came home. Nathan's expression softened almost imperceptibly. That's thoughtful. Thank you. They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Grace gathered her courage. Nathan, I know our marriage isn't real, but that doesn't mean I want to see you suffer. If there's anything I can do to help with the business situation, ... You've done enough, Nathan said. But his tone lacked its usual coldness. The marriage itself was the requirement. The rest is my problem to solve. Grace nodded, turning to leave. But Nathan's voice called her back. Grace. He hesitated, as if the words were difficult to form. I overheard you talking with Maria in the garden today. About art revealing the soul? Grace's breath caught. She hadn't realized he'd been watching. Your sketches, Nathan continued, his voice quieter now. They're extraordinary. You see people in a way that most never bother to look. The compliment sent warmth flooding through Grace's chest. Art helps me understand the world. People are like layered paintings, you know. What you see on the surface is rarely the whole story. Nathan's gaze intensified, as if he were studying her with new eyes. And what do you see when you look at me? The question hung between them, loaded with unexpected vulnerability. Grace met his gaze steadily, her artist's eye taking in the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. The way he held his shoulders, as if braced for another blow. I see someone who's forgotten how to be human, she said gently. Someone who's built such high walls to protect himself that he's trapped inside them. Nathan's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. Perhaps those walls serve a purpose. Perhaps Grace agreed. But walls can't tell the difference between keeping danger out and keeping life out. Before Nathan could respond, the sound of the front door chiming echoed through the mansion. Mrs. Patterson's voice carried down the hallway, announcing unexpected visitors. Mr. and Mrs. Blackstone are here to see you, sir. Nathan straightened immediately, his corporate mask sliding back into place. Show them to the sitting room. I'll be right there. As he adjusted his tie and smoothed his hair, Grace caught a glimpse of the man beneath the businessman. Nathan, she said impulsively, whatever they want, remember that you're stronger than you think. He paused, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Will you join us? As my wife, your presence might help demonstrate the stability they're looking for. Grace nodded, smoothing her simple dress. Together, They walked toward the sitting room, and for the first time since their wedding, she felt like they were facing something as partners rather than strangers. Richard Blackstone was a man who commanded attention through sheer presence. Tall and silver-haired, he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. His wife Eleanor was equally impressive, her diamond jewelry catching the light as she moved with practiced grace. "Nathan," Richard said, rising to shake hands. "And this must be the lovely Grace we've heard so much about." Grace felt Nathan's hand settle gently on the small of her back, a gesture that surprised her with its protective quality. "Grace, these are the Blackstones. Richard, Eleanor, my wife Grace." Eleanor's sharp blue eyes assessed Grace from head to toe, taking in her simple dress and lack of designer accessories. "How charming," she said, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Such a refreshing change from the usual social climbers one meets in these circles." Grace felt the subtle insult, but refused to let it show. Instead, she smiled warmly and moved to pour tea for their guests. "Mr. Blackstone, I understand you're considering a merger with Sterling Innovations. Nathan speaks very highly of your company's values, does he now?" Richard's eyebrows rose as he accepted the cup. "And what would you know about business values, my dear?" Nathan's posture stiffened beside her, but Grace remained calm. "I may not have an MBA, but I understand that the best partnerships are built on mutual respect and shared vision. From what Nathan's told me, both companies are committed to innovation that improves people's lives." Eleanor laughed, a sound like crystal breaking. "How quaint! Nathan, your wife is quite the idealist. Grace sees possibilities where others see only obstacles," Nathan said, his voice carrying a note of pride that surprised even him. "It's one of the many things I admire about her." The conversation continued for another hour, with the Blackstones probing and testing, looking for weaknesses in Nathan's facade of marital stability, but Grace held her own, deflecting their subtle attacks with grace and intelligence. She noticed how Nathan began to relax as the evening progressed, his responses becoming more natural and confident. When the Blackstones finally left, Nathan walked them to their car, while Grace remained in the sitting room, collecting the empty teacups. Through the window, she could see the three of them in intense conversation beside the black Mercedes. "You did well tonight," came Mrs. Patterson's voice from the doorway. "Those two are sharks, but you held your ground beautifully." Grace smiled, stacking the delicate china carefully. "I just tried to be myself, and that," said Nathan's voice from behind her, "was exactly what was needed." Grace turned to find him leaning against the doorframe, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. The corporate mask had slipped away, revealing glimpses of the man underneath. "Did the meeting go well?" she asked. Nathan nodded slowly. "Better than I expected. Richard was impressed by your responses tonight. He said, 'You have substance,' which apparently is rare in his experience with corporate wives." Grace felt a flush of pride at the compliment. "I'm glad I could help." "You did more than help," Nathan said, moving closer. "You were magnificent. The way you handled Eleanor's passive aggression, how you turned Richard's condescension back on itself. You were defending not just yourself but me, our marriage, our arrangement." Grace corrected gently, though something in his eyes made her pulse quicken. "Yes," Nathan said quietly, but the words seemed to carry less conviction than before. "Our arrangement." They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities. For the first time since their wedding night, Grace felt as though she was seeing the real Nathan Sterling, the man hidden beneath layers of ambition and protective steel. "Grace," Nathan said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Thank you. For tonight, for the tea earlier, for not making this situation more difficult than it had to be." Before Grace could respond, Nathan stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. For a heartbeat, she thought he might kiss her, and her breath caught in anticipation. Instead, he reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek for just a moment. "Sleep well, Grace," he murmured. As he walked away, Grace touched her cheek where his fingers had been, her heart racing with something that felt dangerously like hope. The walls between them were beginning to crack, and light was seeping through the fissures. In her room that night, Grace sat by the window sketching by moonlight. But for the first time since arriving at the mansion, she found herself drawing not flowers or architecture, but a pair of steel-gray eyes that held depths she was only beginning to explore. Down the hall, Nathan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Grace's words echoing in his mind. Walls can't tell the difference between keeping danger out and keeping life out, for the first time in years. He wondered if the protection he'd built around his heart might be more prison than sanctuary. Neither of them realized that across the city, Oliver Sterling sat in his own office, plotting ways to ensure his brother's marriage would crumble before it could strengthen Nathan's position with the board. The real tests of their growing connection were yet to come. The autumn air carried a crisp edge as Grace hurried through the hospital corridors, her heart pounding with worry. The call had come at dawn. Her father's condition had taken a sudden turn for the worse. Despite the experimental treatment that Nathan's marriage contract had provided, James Hamilton's weak heart was struggling against complications no one had anticipated. Grace pushed through the doors of the cardiac unit to find her father pale and fragile in the hospital bed, surrounded by beeping monitors and concerned medical staff. Dr. Rodriguez, the lead cardiologist, approached with a grave expression. "Grace, I'm glad you're here," the doctor said gently. "Your father's heart is rejecting the new medication. We need to consider more aggressive treatment options, but they come with significant risks." Grace sank into the bedside chair, taking her father's cool hand in both of hers. James Hamilton's eyes fluttered open, focusing on his daughter's worried face. "My sweet girl," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't look so frightened. I've had a good life, a wonderful daughter." "Don't talk like that, Dad," Grace said, tears threatening to spill. "You're going to be fine. The doctors will figure this out." But even as she spoke the words, Grace felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest. The marriage contract had covered the initial treatment, but these new complications would require procedures that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, money that neither she nor Nathan were obligated to provide under their arrangement. Meanwhile, across the city, Nathan sat in his office reviewing quarterly reports when his assistant knocked urgently on the door. "Mr. Sterling, there's been a development with the Blackstone merger. Oliver is here to see you, and he says it's urgent." Nathan's younger brother entered with his characteristic swagger, his blonde hair perfectly styled, and his expensive suit tailored to perfection. Oliver had always resented being the second son, watching from the sidelines as Nathan inherited their father's empire. At 28, he possessed the family charm, but lacked Nathan's business acumen, a fact that only fueled his ambition. "Brother," Oliver said, settling into the leather chair across from Nathan's desk, "I bring interesting news about your little wife." Nathan's jaw tightened at the dismissive tone. "What about Grace?" Oliver pulled out his phone, scrolling through several photographs with obvious satisfaction. "It seems Mrs. Sterling has been quite busy at the hospital, visiting her sick father, having emotional conversations with doctors about experimental treatments." The photos showed Grace in various states of distress outside the hospital, her face streaked with tears, her shoulders shaking with barely contained sobs. Nathan felt something twist painfully in his chest at the sight of her suffering. "Your point, Oliver?" "My point is that Richard Blackstone doesn't appreciate being deceived," Oliver continued, his smile sharp as a blade. "When he discovers that your marriage is nothing more than a financial arrangement to cover medical bills, he'll withdraw from the merger faster than you can say contract wife." Nathan stood slowly, his hands clenched into fists. "You're threatening to expose Grace." "I'm protecting the family business," Oliver replied smoothly. "The board already has doubts about your leadership. When this scandal breaks, they'll have no choice but to remove you as CEO. I'm prepared to step in, of course. For the good of the company." "Get out," Nathan said, his voice deadly quiet. Oliver rose with theatrical reluctance. "You have until tomorrow evening's charity gala to convince the board and the Blackstones that your marriage is genuine. Otherwise, I'll be forced to reveal the truth to protect Sterling Innovations' reputation." After Oliver left, Nathan sat alone in his office, staring out at the city skyline. For weeks, he had been telling himself that his growing feelings for Grace were irrelevant to their arrangement. But faced with the possibility of losing her, of watching her name dragged through the tabloids while her father fought for his life, Nathan realized the truth he had been avoiding. He was falling in love with his contract wife. That evening, Nathan arrived at the hospital unannounced. Carrying a bouquet of white roses from his mother's prized garden, he found Grace curled in an uncomfortable chair beside her father's bed, her sketchbook open on her lap as she drew to calm her nerves. "Nathan," she said, startled by his presence, "what are you doing here?" "I heard about your father's complications," he said quietly, setting the flowers on the bedside table. "I wanted to see how you were holding up." James Hamilton stirred at the sound of voices, his eyes opening to focus on the tall man standing beside his daughter. Despite his weakness, the older man attempted to sit up straighter. "Mr. Sterling," James said. His voice gaining strength from sheer politeness. "It's good to finally meet you properly. Grace speaks of you often." Nathan felt Grace's surprised gaze on him as he moved closer to the bed. "Please, call me Nathan. And don't strain yourself, sir. Grace has told me so much about you that I feel like we're already family." The lie came easily. But as Nathan looked into James Hamilton's kind eyes, so similar to Grace's, he realized it didn't feel like a lie at all. This man had raised the extraordinary woman who was gradually changing Nathan's entire worldview. "Take care of my daughter," James whispered, his hand reaching weakly toward Nathan. "She's stronger than she appears. But she needs someone who sees her true worth." Nathan clasped the older man's hand gently, his voice thick with unexpected emotion. "I'm beginning to understand just how remarkable she is, sir." "You have my word that I'll protect her," Grace stared at Nathan in amazement. This wasn't the cold businessman she had married, or even the slightly warmer man she had been getting to know. This was someone entirely different, someone who spoke to her father with genuine respect and compassion. Later, as they walked through the hospital parking garage, Grace finally found her voice. "You didn't have to come here, Nathan. This isn't part of our arrangement." Nathan stopped beside his car, turning to face her fully. "Maybe I'm tired of hiding behind arrangements and contracts." "What do you mean?" Nathan took a deep breath, his steel-gray eyes meeting hers with startling intensity. "I mean that somewhere between your first smile and your defense of our marriage to the Blackstones, this stopped being about business for me." Grace's heart began to race. "Nathan, ... I know this wasn't supposed to happen," he continued, stepping closer. "I know we agreed to keep things simple, professional, but Grace, when I saw those photos of you crying outside the hospital today, when I imagined losing you to Oliver's schemes, I realized something that terrifies me." "What?" Grace whispered. "I'm in love with you," Nathan said, his voice rough with vulnerability. "Not with my contract wife, not with the woman who's helping stabilize my image. I'm in love with Grace Hamilton, the artist who sees beauty in everything. The daughter who would sacrifice her dreams for her father. The woman who looked past my walls and saw something worth believing in." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "Nathan, double quotes. "You don't have to say anything," Nathan said quickly, misreading her hesitation. "I know this complicates everything. But tomorrow night at the charity gala, Oliver plans to expose our arrangement to destroy the merger. Before that happens, I wanted you to know the truth about how I feel." Grace reached up and placed her palm against Nathan's cheek, feeling the slight roughness of his 5 o'clock shadow. "You beautiful, impossible man," she whispered. "Don't you realize I've been falling in love with you too?" Nathan's eyes widened in shock and hope. "Grace, ... I tried so hard to keep my heart protected," she continued, tears flowing freely now. "I told myself this was just survival, just a way to save my father. But you've been so much more than I expected. The way you defended me to the Blackstones, how you've treated the staff with respect, the gentleness you don't think anyone sees." Nathan cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I don't deserve you. That's not your choice to make," Grace said firmly. "Love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing each other every day, even when it's difficult." This time, when Nathan kissed her, it was nothing like their brief, perfunctory wedding kiss. This was a kiss full of passion and promise, of all the emotions they had been holding back for weeks. Grace melted into his embrace, feeling truly safe for the first time since her father's diagnosis. The next evening, the Sterling mansion buzzed with activity as preparations for the annual Sterling Foundation Charity Gala reached their peak. This year's event would be held at the mansion itself, with the ballroom transformed into an elegant showcase for the city's elite. Grace stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the flowing emerald gown that Nathan had surprised her with that morning. The dress was stunning, clearly custom-made to complement her coloring and figure. With it had come a note in Nathan's bold handwriting. "For the woman who taught me that true beauty comes from within." Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, her eyes bright with approval. "You look absolutely radiant. Dear Mr. Nathan won't be able to take his eyes off you." Grace smiled, touching the simple pearl necklace her father had given her for her 21st birthday. It was modest compared to the elaborate jewelry worn by most of the women downstairs, but it carried more meaning than any diamond. "Mrs. Patterson," Grace said suddenly, "what was Nathan like before? Before his father died? Before all the pressure?" The older woman's expression softened with memory. "He was different then. Lighter somehow. He loved to paint, before the business consumed everything. His father encouraged it. He said every man needed something that fed his soul." Grace's eyes widened in surprise. "Nathan painted beautiful landscapes mostly. He had a real talent for it. But after Mr. Sterling Sr. passed, Nathan put away his brushes and never picked them up again. Said art was a luxury he couldn't afford." Grace felt her heart clench with understanding. Nathan had sacrificed his own artistic nature to become the corporate leader his family needed. No wonder he had seemed to understand her sketches so intuitively. Downstairs, the ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and elaborate floral arrangements. Society's most influential figures mingled over champagne and canapes, their conversations a careful dance of business and social maneuvering. Nathan moved through the crowd with practiced ease, but his eyes kept drifting toward the grand staircase, waiting for Grace to appear. Oliver Sterling held court near the bar, his laugh a little too loud, his gestures a little too animated. He had been drinking steadily since arriving, building his courage for the confrontation he had planned. Several board members clustered around him, listening to his carefully crafted hints about Nathan's marriage, of course. "We all hope Nathan's found happiness," Oliver was saying, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "Though one has to wonder about the timing, doesn't one?" So convenient. Just when the board was pressuring him to settle down, Richard Blackstone approached Nathan near the entrance, his expression unreadable. "Beautiful event, Nathan. Though I must say, there are some interesting rumors circulating about your marriage." Nathan's jaw tightened. But before he could respond, a collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Every head turned toward the staircase, where Grace was descending like something from a fairy tale. The emerald gown flowed around her like water, and her hair was swept up in an elegant style that showcased the graceful line of her neck. But, it wasn't just her physical beauty that commanded attention. There was something luminous about Grace, confidence and grace that made her shine brighter than any of the jewels in the room. She moved with the poise of a woman who knew her own worth, and Nathan felt his breath catch in his throat. "My God," Richard murmured beside him. "She's absolutely stunning." Nathan couldn't tear his eyes away as Grace reached the bottom of the staircase and smiled at him across the crowded room. In that moment, every doubt he had ever harbored about their arrangement vanished completely. This wasn't about business or appearances anymore. This was about love, pure and simple. He crossed the ballroom with determined strides, ignoring the conversations that died in his wake. When he reached Grace, he offered her his arm with a smile that was anything but businesslike. "You're absolutely breathtaking," he murmured for her ears alone. "You clean up pretty well yourself," Grace replied, her eyes sparkling with mischief as she took in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. As they moved through the crowd together, Nathan felt a sense of rightness that he had never experienced before. Grace handled each introduction with warmth and intelligence, asking thoughtful questions about people's work and families, rather than engaging in the usual superficial small talk. When the orchestra began playing, Nathan led Grace onto the dance floor. As they swayed together to the gentle melody, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. "Whatever happens tonight," Nathan said quietly, "I want you to know that this year with you has been the best of my life." Grace looked up at him with eyes full of love. "Nathan, about my father's medical bills, double quotes, already taken care of," Nathan said firmly. "Whatever he needs for as long as he needs it. That's not a contract obligation, Grace. That's what family does for each other." Before Grace could respond, Oliver's voice cut through the music like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment." The orchestra stopped playing as Oliver stepped onto the small stage, his face flushed with alcohol and malicious intent. Nathan's hand tightened protectively around Grace's waist. "I think it's time we all learn the truth about my brother's touching love story," Oliver announced, his words slightly slurred but perfectly audible. A murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd. Nathan started toward the stage, but Grace caught his arm. "Let me," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Before Nathan could protest, Grace stepped forward, her chin raised with quiet dignity. The crowd parted for her as she approached the stage, her emerald gown rustling softly in the sudden silence. "You're absolutely right, Oliver," Grace said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "It's time everyone knew the truth." Oliver's smile faltered slightly as Grace climbed the steps to join him on the stage. This wasn't how he had planned for this to unfold. "The truth is," Grace continued, turning to face the assembled guests, "that Nathan Sterling married me under extraordinary circumstances. My father was dying, and I was desperate. Nathan could have chosen any woman in this room, someone with the right connections and the perfect pedigree." The crowd hung on every word, sensing drama but unsure of its direction. Instead, Grace's voice grew stronger. "He chose to help a stranger save the most important person in her world. He married me not because I could enhance his image or advance his career, but because he has a heart that's bigger than his bank account." Nathan stared at her in amazement, seeing her face glow with fierce love and pride. "Yes, our marriage began as an arrangement," Grace admitted, her eyes finding Nathan's across the room. "But what grew from that arrangement is the most real thing I've ever experienced. Nathan Sterling is the most honorable man I know. He kept his word to a desperate woman, and then he did something even more remarkable." She paused, her voice breaking slightly with emotion. "He taught me that love isn't about deserving or earning. It's about seeing someone's true heart and choosing to cherish it. So Oliver is right. You should all know the truth. The truth is that I love my husband more than I ever thought possible, and I would marry him again tomorrow." Arrangement or no arrangement, the ballroom erupted in applause. But Grace only had eyes for Nathan as he strode across the floor and swept her into his arms. Their kiss was passionate and public, a declaration that needed no words. When they finally broke apart, Nathan took the microphone from Oliver's nerveless fingers. "My wife," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is the strongest, most generous person I've ever known. She saved me from a life of cold contracts and empty success. Oliver, if you want my position, you're welcome to try to take it. But you'll never have what I have now." Richard Blackstone stepped forward, beginning a slow clap that spread throughout the ballroom. "Now that," he said with a broad smile, "is the kind of partnership Sterling Innovations needs. Nathan, you have my full support for the merger." As the crowd dispersed, chattering excitedly about the evening's drama, Nathan and Grace found themselves alone on the stage. Oliver had slipped away in defeat, his schemes crumbling in the face of genuine love. "I can't believe you did that," Nathan said, cradling Grace's face in his hands. "Which part?" Grace asked with a shaky laugh. "All of it. Standing up to Oliver, telling the truth. Defending me when I should have been protecting you." Grace smiled, reaching up to straighten his bow tie. "That's what partners do, Nathan. We protect each other." 6 months later, Grace stood in the same ballroom, but everything was different. The space had been transformed into an art gallery showcasing her paintings, with proceeds benefiting the hospital foundation that had helped save her father's life. James Hamilton, recovered and strong again, stood proudly beside Nathan as they watched Grace give interviews to art critics and potential buyers. "She's remarkable," James said to Nathan, his voice full of paternal pride. "She is," Nathan agreed, his eyes never leaving his wife's animated face as she discussed her work. "Did you know she convinced me to start painting again?" James smiled knowingly. "Grace has a way of bringing out the best in people. It's her greatest gift." Later that evening, after the last guest had left and the paintings had been carefully stored away, Nathan and Grace walked hand in hand through their garden. The roses were blooming again, filling the air with their sweet perfume. "Nathan," Grace said suddenly, stopping beside the fountain where koi fish swam lazily in the moonlight. "Yes." Grace turned to face him, her eyes sparkling with mischief and love. "I have something to tell you." Nathan's heart skipped a beat at her tone. "What is it?" Grace took his hands in hers, placing them gently on her still flat stomach. "In about 7 months, our family is going to grow by one very small sterling." Nathan's eyes widened in shock and wonder. "Grace, are you saying ... I'm pregnant?" she whispered, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. Nathan whooped with joy, lifting Grace off her feet and spinning her around until she was dizzy with laughter. When he finally set her down, he knelt beside the fountain and pressed a gentle kiss to her stomach. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Your mommy is the most amazing woman in the world, and I promise to spend every day proving that you're both deserving of all the love I have too." Give. As they walked back toward the mansion, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as a desperate arrangement had blossomed into a love story more beautiful than any fairy tale. They had both learned that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as obligations, and that love has a way of finding even the most carefully guarded hearts. The contract that had bound them together had long since been replaced by something far stronger: the daily choice to love, honor, and cherish each other through whatever storms might come. And as Nathan opened the front door for his pregnant wife, he knew that their real adventure was just beginning. Inside the mansion that had once felt like a cold museum, love had taken root and flourished. The walls that had once imprisoned Nathan's heart had become the foundation for a home filled with laughter, art, and the promise of new life. Grace had been right all along. Walls could protect, but only love could truly set a soul free.